Welcome to All Things Marketing Podcast, the podcast that talks all things marketing for both franchise and multi-location marketing leaders. ATM is brought to you by PureDriven. We'll show you how to turn your brand into a money-making machine. Here's your host, Steve Rockwood.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to ATM. My name is Steve Rockwood. I am the marketing manager at PureDriven, and today we are going to be talking about Snapchat marketing for retail franchises. I am joined by special guest Priscilla Rockwood, a Snapchat technician at PureDriven, as well as my wife. Priscilla, how are you doing today?
Hi, everybody. I'm doing okay. First time on here. Pretty excited.
First time caller, long time listener.
Yeah, basically. I think so.
You've actually transcribed a few episodes for us on the blog before.
I have, way in the early days.
Yep, one of our number one listeners here. And you get to hear me do it through the door every once in a while.
Only listener.
In the house, only listener. What? We actually just broke 1,000 listens this week, so we're doing pretty well.
On repeat.
On refresh. Hopefully they're unique listeners. So today we're talking about Snapchat because you are the Snapchat technician at PureDriven along with one other Snapchat technician.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you a few questions about Snapchat.
Okie dokie.
So my first question is, what does a typical Snapchat ad consist of?
Okay, well, a typical Snapchat first consists of the content, which could either be a video, an image, a set of images, like a slideshow. And after choosing one of those, you pick a headline, typically has to do with the event, if there's a clearance event or, we buy and sell, et cetera, et cetera. And then the brand name of whatever company.
Yeah, so the headline and brand name, they're not on the image or the video themselves. They're in the top left of the screen, right?
Yes, top left.
All right, so it's just kind of like the text that's there. And then at the bottom of the screen, you can actually usually swipe up. So what does that do? There's another button at the bottom. What does that do for the person who sees the ad?
So when creating a Snapchat ad, the company, like I said, decides to make an event. And if so, the swipe up leads to an ad link. So their webpage or their deals and events page, things like that. It takes them to where the company wants them to go.
Gotcha. All right, so my next question for you is, what does a typical monthly budget look like for a Snapchat campaign?
Typically, for a Snapchat campaign, we recommend $50 minimum a day, and then starting off with a $200 ad spend a month, and then seeing how that goes. And if it goes well, going on to Snapchat Plus, which they could add 3 or 4 ads a month, depending on the client's needs, basically.
Yeah, and the minimum on Snapchat is $50 a day, but it doesn't necessarily spend it all for everybody. So if you're in a really popular area, you'll probably spend your $50 in one day quite easily. But if there's not as many people in the area that you're trying to target, you might not hit that $50 ad spend. So even though Snapchat says you need to spend $50 a day, theoretically you could spend $20 and then pause the campaign if you really wanted to.
Yeah.
Awesome. My last question for you, at least on this very early introduction to Snapchat, I'm sure we'll come on the podcast and talk more in depth later, but my final question for you today is, what type of landing page should advertisers link the ad to? This brings us back to that swipe up that we talked about in that first question.
So, like I mentioned before, it's recommended to do like a deals and events page, or even just a web page showcasing what's going on. And if not, then we just do their home page.
Makes sense. And then I guess I do have one more question for you.
Last question?
Last question. This usually happens on here quite often where I have a last question that turns into a last question, which turns into another last question.
Exciting.
Let's say you're advertising a retail store that's a clothing store. Could you just give us an example of what the slideshow would look like? Let's say it's a clearance event. Could you just give us an example of what that would actually look like for an ad?
Okay, I guess it depends on the creative available. So sometimes companies like specific creative, which we don't necessarily have on hand, or sometimes we do. So for example, let's say they have a clearance event, like you mentioned. We have clearance creative, and I guess I go ahead and just choose what it is. So if it's a slideshow, I'll choose 3 different images consisting of clearance, 50% clearance or anything like that. And then I just put it together in a 10-second slideshow where they transition, amongst each other. If not, if the company or the client has a video they would like to put up, I just use that instead.
Gotcha. And then I guess the headline would just be advertising that event, right?
Yes, correct.
Awesome. With the hours and probably the percentage and all that.
Yeah.
Well, Priscilla, that is all we have time for today. Thank you for joining me.
I had no choice.
We had no choice. This is true. We do live together, and it's her monthly duty as my wife to hop on the podcast. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you right here next time on ATM.
You just listened to All Things Marketing Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast to catch every new episode every day. Want to be a guest on the show? Sign up at puredriven.com/guest. See you tomorrow here at the ATM.